In today's video, we're going to talk about the ethnocentrism and relativism. So what is ethnocentrism all about? Ethnocentrism is judging another culture solely by the values and standards of one's own culture. Ethnocentric individuals judge other groups relative to their own ethnic or culture, especially with concerns for language, behavior, customs, and religion. And these ethnic distinctions and subdivisions serve to define each culture's ethnicity's unique cultural identity. And according to William G. Sumner, ethnocentrism is defined as the technical name for the view of things in which one's own group is the center of everything, and all others are scaled and rated with reference to it. He even further characterized it as often leading to pride, vanity, beliefs of one's own group's superiority, and contempt of outsiders. In the study of anthropology, ethnocentric are those people who are born into a particular culture that grow absorbing the values and behaviors of the culture will develop a worldview that considers their culture to be the norm or the standard. For example, in American society, the popular belief among American ethnocentric people is that their country, culture, values, development, and everything else is superior to every other nation in the world, and that every nation is inferior to the United States. And this belief has led to political meddling among the matters of other countries, leading to misunderstandings and miscommunications between different countries in the world. If people then experiences other cultures that have different values, norms, normal behaviors, they will find that the thought pattern appropriate to their birth culture are not appropriate for the new culture. However, since people are accustomed to the birth culture, it can be difficult for them to see the behaviors of people from a different culture, from the viewpoint of that culture rather than their own. Examples of ethnocentrism include religiocentric constructs claiming a divine association like divine nation, one nation under God, God's own country, God's chosen people, and God's promised land. Cultural relativism is the principle that an individual person's beliefs and activities should be understood by others in terms of what that individual's own culture. It refers to not judging culture to our own standards of what is right or wrong, strange or normal. Instead, we should try to understand the cultural practices of other groups in its own cultural context. For example, instead of thinking that fried crickets are disgusting, one should instead ask, why do some cultures eat fried insects? And cultural relativism has two categories. First is the absolute, which means everything that happens within a culture must and should not be questioned by outsiders. For example, Nazi Party's point of view justifying the Holocaust. Second category is critical. Critical creates questions about cultural practices in terms of who is accepting them and why. It also recognizes power and relationships. Cultural relativism, it was established as accepted in anthropological research by Franz Boas in the first few decades of the 20th century and later popularized by his students. Cultural relativism was in part a response to Western ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism may take obvious forms in which one consciously believes that one's people's art are the most beautiful, values the most virtuous, and beliefs the most truthful. Bose first articulated the idea in 1887 that civilization is not something absolute but is relative, and Our ideas and conceptions are true only so far as our civilization goes. However, Bose did not coin the term. Franz Bose, originally trained in physics and geography, argued that one's culture may mediate and thus limits one's perception in less obvious ways. He understood culture to include not only certain tastes in food, art, and music or beliefs about religion. He assumed a much broader notion of culture defined as the totality of the mental and physical reactions and activities that characterize the behavior of the individuals composing a social group, collectively and individually in relation to their natural environment, to other groups, to members of the group itself, and of each individual to himself. And this understanding of culture confronts anthropologists with two problems. First is how to escape the unconscious bonds of one's own culture, which inevitably bias our perceptions of and reactions to the world. And second, how to make sense of an unfamiliar culture. In generalization, ethnocentrism, the tendency to assume that one's own culture and way of life represent the norm or are superior to all others, while cultural relativism, the viewing of people's behavior from the perspective of their own culture. The similarities and differences between ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, both these viewpoints or concepts present extremist views. For example, while ethnocentrism leans towards intolerance, cultural relativism leans towards some incredibly high tolerance of cultural features, and both views present negative connotations. Ethnocentrism, in its extreme form, gives rise to an supremacist, while cultural relativism allows the propagation of certain practices that basic human rights in terms of sensitivity. Ethnocentrism is insensitive to other cultures, while cultural relativism shows high cultural sensitivity. And these views involve examining a culture and all its aspects and evaluating them, and the basis for evaluation differs according to the view employed.